Good morning and welcome to Morning Talk with the Artist Forge. My name is Nicole York. I'm going to be your host this morning. As you can tell, haven't been awake for that long, but we're here. With me today are your co-hosts, Matt Stagliano and Becca Bjorky. Good morning, y'all.
Good morning.
Matt, you look much more awake.
I'm decidedly more sober too. All the caffeine. Hi, good morning, guys.
Hi, good morning. I'm hoping my treadmill is going to help me wake up a little bit this morning. How are you, Becca? One eye and a cup of coffee. That's all you need. Good morning, everybody. If you're in the audience today, if you're hanging out with us in Facebook land or on YouTube, please go ahead and say hi. We want to know who's here so we know who we're hanging with this morning. And of course, you know, the best part of doing this is that we all get to be together. So say hi in the comments. We'll drag your comment up here and say good morning. So, of course, visual literacy, topic of the day, as it has been for the last few weeks. We've been talking about how we interpret what we see and what contributes to that interpretation. What kind of visual, mental, and evolutionary levers are being pulled by the art we're looking at to help us understand what it is the artist intended, what the piece of art is meant to be, how it's meant to affect us, all those good things. So we have some friends joining us from Facebook land. Is this Sharon? Crystal. Is anybody on Facebook and they can tell? It's Crystal? Good morning. Remember, if you want StreamYard to be able to show your images, you do have to give StreamYard permission from Facebook, unfortunately. So make sure you do that if you want us to see, but otherwise, just continue commenting on and we'll know where you're at. All right. So last night, we got the chance to look at a few images, break them down visually in a way that we haven't quite done before, trying to see if we could figure out what the intent of the artist was through what they included in the frame, which was a whole lot of fun. And today we're going to be focusing on environment. So we've looked at things like how theme affects our understanding of an image, how influence affects our understanding of an image, how context affects our understanding of an image. And today we're going to be looking at environment and seeing what environment adds to an image and how that affects the way we understand what the image is for, who the subject is, what the subject matter is, all that good stuff. So we're going to be looking at several different images today just to see if we can figure it out. But before we do that, I want to ask Matt and Becca and our friends who are in the audience today, how do you consider environment when you're planning a piece of visual art? And I know this looks different for all of us depending on the kind of art we're making. So a sculpture, like somebody who is a sculptor, they may have a very different idea of how environment adds to the interpretation of their art, whereas a digital artist or somebody who does, traditional oil painting, environment may look different for all of us and in different contexts. So Erica's here with us this morning. Yay! Hello, Erica. So glad to have you with us. Excited you could join. So Matt, Becca, how do you guys think about environment when you are creating a piece of art? Or is it even something that you consider? And if you do, what are some of the considerations that you have?
So for me, doing predominantly portrait work in a studio, environment's not a huge thing for me, right? I'm looking at the composition and I'm looking at the scene and I'm looking at understanding what's going to be incorporated in the image. But because I'm in the studio, I'm not dealing with large scale environments. And unless I'm doing composite work and I want to put a plate behind a subject, right? Because then I'm thinking, all right, well, I've got to marry light together. I've got to understand, perspective and composition and all of that. So I don't do a ton of that work. If I'm doing personal work like that, then I'm really taking an understanding of, all right, what are all the elements together? Because it's not just subject and environment, it's the environment and how does the subject fit into that? That's the way that I think about it, right? So when I am doing the personal work, I take a little bit more care, but I'd say 95% of the time, I'm just dealing with a backdrop and a light in the studio, and I'm not really spending a ton of time. Whereas Becca, I assume you're doing way more than that. Maybe.
But I mean, like, okay, so even studio portraits, because there's I mean, that's something that people go and seek out, is that specific environment in the end product of looking like you're in a photo studio, right? Like, do you feel like that particular environment, whether how it looks when you're creating the pictures with your clients, or just how it looks in the end product, do you feel like that is a really important part of that process though?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, you compare certain portrait artists' work, right? You look at Johnny Edward, right? And he's all about the environment in his picture. He's got layers upon layers and textures, and he's shooting wide, and you get a much better feel for the subject in the space. A lot of portrait artists are just backdrop and, chest up, right? So thinking about that, like, what am I shooting? How wide am I shooting? What do I want that story to be? I might add some more things into the studio, but for the most of the time, my stuff is relatively simple. But yeah, Becky, you're absolutely right. I think there are a lot of those components that do play in, probably not to the degree that people think about them, like environment, like the word environment, we're thinking outside, nature and all that, but it absolutely plays in the exact same way. So no, you're right. You're right.
I want to grab that as well, because I think it's interesting when you're looking at those kind of blank backdrops in a studio setting where all the context is removed. There's a really important point to that too, right? Because what we're doing is telling the viewer the person is important here and nothing else matters, right? Like, outside of context, here is a person, focus on their face, their bone structure, their expression, their clothes, right? Like, so kind of removing environment in a way, even though in the back of our heads, we know that this is a studio setting, but removing environment in a way is a kind of isolationist technique, right? Like let's get rid of everything that doesn't matter. And here is our person. So I think like even the removal of environment can become at that time, like really profound, right?
Yeah, and again, it ties into the story. What are you trying to say with the subject, right? Even in a portrait, you can have environmental components that are really going to contribute to that story, or you can have an expression. They could be looking off, and you're starting to think about what environment are they in, right? So there's a lot of different ways to approach it from the studio standpoint, but it is an important component. I think I'm probably a bit more dismissive of it than I probably should be, mainly because it's become intuitive of what's going on in the studio. But when I get back outside and I'm doing in like an outside type of portrait, yeah, then it really plays in, and I'm much more focused on what's going on in every aspect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and I think sometimes as portrait photographers, particularly those of us working in studio, it can be really easy to just kind of forget that we're making still an artistic choice, right? Like to shoot in studio and to remove context is still an artistic choice that we're making. And sometimes we can get so used to those things that are familiar, I think we can overlook them really quickly. Good morning, Kat.
Good morning.
So glad that you can join us this morning.
Yeah, my dad handed me a Nikon,
Ooh.
and I don't know what it is, so I'm reviewing it, but there's film in it.
Oh,
yeah. Which is something that my dad shot in like 1982.
So it's time to figure out what the mystery is.
I love a good mystery.
Yes. Okay, so actually, I think beginning with studio portraits is a great way to start. I have a couple of things that we can look at really quick visually just to start getting an idea of how the impact changes in kind of two shots that are relatively similar enough, and we can kind of pick them apart a little bit. But before I do that, if you're in the audience today, we want to hear from you. Say hi so we know who's here. That way we can talk directly to you guys and get feedback from you and hear your thoughts as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to look beginning at a couple of images, starting with a studio portrait, just a really studio portrait. Up here in the comments, you can see I've just downloaded a few things from Unsplash. This by Photo Sushi, a name that I cannot pronounce. Please forgive me if you do happen to see this. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this large for a second. And the fact, just like we were talking about earlier, Matt, that we have removed all context means that we have to rely on the subject. We have to rely on the light. We have to rely on expression, framing, clothing, right? Like we've kind of condensed our visual literacy down to a smaller area. And now those are what we have to interpret by, right? And so, you know, if we had to kind of look at this and interpret this by the lack of environment, how do we start to see this image? What do we see here?
I think for me, I'll jump in. Since it's so stark, right? I'm really now concentrating on light and expression and angle and composition. And I know as an unsplash photo, you can crop this however you want and kind of get in. But as the image sits right now, it's clearly with that background being lit the way it is, the focus is on the subject, the way that the light's hitting, the focus on the subject. But what concerns me is where he's looking. What's in the environment? What is he looking at? Right. And that's the thing that gets me. But yeah, I mean, I like the image for what it is. It's just a picture of a guy. It's clean, it's sharp, it's lit well, but there's not a whole lot more to it. I would love to see this taken out and him put on something else to tell a bit more story, but I like it the way it is.
Yeah. So really quickly, hi to Sarah. Sarah's with us as well. Good morning, Sarah. If you have any thoughts in the audience today on this image and the lack of environment and how that changes the way we interpret it, would love to hear your thoughts. So go ahead and share that in the comments. And I know for me, obviously, some of the same things, Matt. I don't mind his eyes being off camera. It kind of, his body posture, the way he has his head turned, his expression. And then, of course, you mentioned the light as well on the background. So we have this nice gradient that's coming from behind him, which makes, you know, him kind of the source of the light in a way. So there's almost kind of a heroic thing happening, right? Like the turn of the shoulders, and his shoulders are down and his chin is up and he's got a kind of a self-deprecating smile on his face. You're like, here is a person who has thoughts about things, you know, like that's kind of that feeling that you get. And you could totally see, if you were to extend the backdrop in one direction, copy over here. And maybe this guy's he's like, he reminds me of somebody who started some kind of business that wants to change the future, right? And on one side is going to be all this copy that's like, he figured it out. So the removal of that means that we don't have any additional context to use to try to interpret who this person is or what they think. All we have is them. And let's just compare that really quickly to an image like this one. A guy in glasses and a simple shirt, right? And of course, we have a lighting change here. But the change of environment, I think, makes a really big difference. So, so what happens when we look at this? Like, what's the difference now between this image and the last one when we compare the environment that they're in?
Well, there's more indicators, right? There's more indicators of what he might do or where he might be versus the insurance agent that we were just looking at. You know, this guy's in a workshop of some sort, or in a space or a mill, and his expression is one of like a hard worker, right? He's just giving you more context and more story, even though the stuff in the background is blurred out enough that you really can't tell what it is, but it's giving you that feel with the shadows and the old windows that this is a working guy of some sort. And I think that environment, if he were put on just a gray background, I'd be like, oh, here's a hipster dude, right? But it's way different and much more impactful to look at this in whole than the last image, just giving me way more to work with and look at and be interested in.
That's interesting. You think he's working. Okay. Nicole, do you have a better idea of what the background actually is? I can't really.
No, but I can zoom in really quickly. So this is kind of just from Unsplash. So it's difficult to tell. Everything is obviously got some nice blur going on back there.
I'm going filmmaker who likes the Beatles.
Yeah, this is like still giving me more hipster than hardworking warehouse for sure.
Same.
Like this is the kind of pictures like I would take when I was like 17 years old and my stoner art friends. You know, because the art and like the soft focus and it like feels like this is a great photograph because it's technically really sharp and cool. And it is, it's beautiful. But yeah, it still feels, it has that sense of youth to it for sure.
And I think, I mean, I get the sense of art studio. It has that kind of messy, like, you know, we painted it and left it there kind of thing. My paints are here and my other things are there. And for me, I think trying to remove then the other context clues, because as we mentioned before, when we're in that studio shot, all we have is the subject. But when we give them environment, all of a sudden there's a new depth that gets added here. So if we were to look at everything and say, these glasses, these are artisty glasses, right? Like these are John Lennon glasses. And so if you start to put that together with, you know, the disheveled hair and everything else, then you start to make an interpretation that you can't make about this guy, because we have nothing else. For this, it's a headshot that's a kind of a corporate-y kind of thing. He's wearing a collared shirt, and so we have his clothes to interpret by. His glasses, super clean, have that kind of tech guy type look to them. And those are the only guesses we get. Whereas in this case, now we have environment that gets to influence our interpretation as well. So I'm going to move up to some of the images that Kat shared this morning and get your thoughts, Kat, because obviously these are, you know, some things that you got to do. So how do you feel like as you're creating these, you're thinking of environment and then bringing that into play? What is it that you're hoping by including environments like this, the viewer is getting to understand about the subject?
I think that the biggest piece of the puzzle for this particular location, right, was, you know, there are two different types of St. Mark's Square that you can showcase, right? And if you go at 2 p.m, it's flooded with just thousands of people. Or you can go at dawn and take out the 2 people that are over there by the door, and just have it be, you know, about the story of this woman who's alone, and she's in this like hugely historic place, all by herself, you know, just taking it all in. It's that dream space, right? Like, how epic would this be? And then bringing in, you know, like, okay, well, let's not just go straight on with the church. Like, let's bring in the rest of the square so you can have some angles to work with and have her dance. And, you know, you see like the pigeons everywhere, and they're not even bothered by her. So it's like, it's her very own, right? Because she's alone in this place, whereas anybody else at any other time would go to St. Mark's Square and just be surrounded by people and pigeons just like dive bombing you for your sandwich and pizza and all the things. So it's just about like elevating the subject with the location at the perfect time when it's doing what it is that you want it to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and I love that you mentioned as well how different times of day can then affect because if she were to be there surrounded by people, this would feel like a totally different story. This wouldn't feel like maybe a princess has wandered out into the magical city. This would feel like a tourist that came in a big fluffy dress, right? Like it would feel totally different. Yeah. So Becca, Matt, would love to hear your thoughts on like, for images like this, when we have a kind of extraordinary environment, how that can then play into what we're trying to say about our, excuse me, our subject. Becca can't find the unmute button. It says, I can't help you because you chose to do it.
I found it. Sorry, there's a little cat here who's screaming at the microphone. So if you hear cat screaming, that's what that is. But yeah, I mean, so I'm a big like proponent of the environment being a character unto itself. And as any situation where you have multiple characters inside of a scene, there's going to be some sort of relationship between the two, right? And they're interacting with one another, even though the landscape or the environment is the static, unalive, it's a really not living thing. It still has its own sense of character, its own sense of reaction and action that's happening. And so I think it's really, really important to consider that, as Kat did, what is the environment? How is it behaving in certain times of day? How is it behaving in the time, like in the weather, in the, atmosphere as a whole? So looking at what you want to get out of the environment, what characteristics you want to give to it that it isn't maybe already giving out on its own. For instance, where you have this big, beautiful building here, do you want to be shooting upwards? Do you want to give it that kind of sense of scale and grandeur? Do you want to, throw a drone up in the air and take the image from that way? It's going to change your perspective and understanding of the character of the place. And then, of course, your understanding and perspective of the humanoid or, living character that you're putting in it. So looking at that relationship, I think, is so, so, so important.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Becca says. I don't have a whole lot more to say. I think the way that Kat used the composition as well and positioning the subject in this huge environment, right? Making sure that, it might be a little bit off center, but positioned between these buildings correctly so that your eye still flows to the subject rather than getting caught up in the architecture, I think, could be totally lost if you moved 15 feet to the left and now she's against this big, large building. So, and it gives you a completely different feel for it. So understanding not only the environment, but your placement, your composition, and all the other elements that Becca was talking about make this much more attractive than probably what I would do, which is go when it's really crowded and try to put her flat against the building. So yeah, this is why Kat's kind of a master storyteller. There's so much more here based on those elements and how she positioned everything.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be able to then not just the environment itself, right? But the time, as Kat mentioned, and then Matt, as you and Becca mentioned, the location of the person taking the photo. What angle are we looking at this from? How are we positioning things within the frame? So as a continuing example of that, I'm going to pull up another couple of images. Let me see if I can find the right one. So we've got, I'm going to show a couple, and then we're going to just kind of compare them. Whoops, wrong one. And make sure that I'm going the right direction here. I think I should have, I thought I should have.
We're going to Utah, y'all.
Right? We're going to the Salt Flats, sucker. I thought I should have had, I felt like I had one more, but maybe I was wrong. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So we have maybe Mars, right? Or again, the Moab, right? We have maybe that. And then we have somewhere Earth, maybe some other planet. And then we have something you expect, right? So when we see these three, we have an astronaut in a place we expect an astronaut to be, is the moon. So we can assume this probably was, actually taken by another astronaut or maybe a remote camera or something. But then we have, not that one, but then we have other ones all of a sudden. And we have a glove off as well. So we have these other environments now. Imagine if we were to take this astronaut and stick them in a city. What do these different environments of the same subject matter tell us about what's happening or what the story is, right? So I'd love to hear then, if you're in the audience this morning, sometimes we can use environment to contrast with the subject matter or to continue to support the subject matter. And both of those things can tell an entirely different story. So if you have thoughts there, I would love to hear them. And then, of course, same for y'all. And I just want to make sure we say hi too. So we've got some more friends joining us. I don't know who you are, unfortunately, because StreamYard does not have permission to use your Facebook name. So if you want to add that so that we can say hi to you personally, let's go ahead and do that. Also, Paulina is here. Hi, Paulina. So contrasting environment or unexpected environment, what can that kind of help us understand about subject matter?
I think it drives, is this a realistic photo or, some derivation of it, right? So this one, for example, it absolutely could be Mars with the visor down and sealed up spacesuit, could absolutely be in another planet taken by another astronaut, right? But you're feeling this sense of desolation and isolation and loneliness and, just vastness of space or whatever planet they're on. Whereas, the moon is the moon and the salt flats, here's a guy, hey, you take your glove off and your visor up, Is that the safest thing? I don't know if that's OSHA approved in space. And, but seeing him there in a white background with a white spacesuit all plays in color wise. Here, your eye is drawn to that, that white astronaut, and you're zoomed in straight on the subject rather than the environment. The environment plays into the story, but I'm still looking at the subject. In the other ones, especially the white one, the foreground, the subject and the environment are so blended together. It's more you're looking at the thing as a whole rather than just at the subject. That's the way that I'm emotionally connecting with these, right?
Sure.
One, the subject blends in, one he's stark against. So I think it gives me different stories, different feelings.
Yeah. And I think the fact that we know humans from Earth are not traveling to Mars yet, right? Like that's a thing we know. And so that immediately puts this in sci-fi territory. Like the story becomes we cannot look at this and say, yeah, this could have been taken, by Neil Armstrong. No, this isn't
unless
a thing
you're
that has
Elon
happened
Musk,
yet, right? So this is sci-fi. Like you now, the cultural interpretation of what we understand about reality comes in to what we know about the environment. And we have two options. Here's a place on Earth that somebody's, gone to in an astronaut suit. And what is the likelihood of that versus here's a sci-fi image of somebody having traveled to a different planet, a desert planet, they're on Tatooine or something. Like that's a whole different interpretation, right?
What's interesting about this too, when it comes to creating environment especially, is the sense of atmosphere here, or the lack thereof. That actually I feel like makes it really feel a lot more like space. Like if we look back at those like actual moon photos, or something that is taken in outer space, it has a very different sense of atmosphere than you'd have in many places on planet Earth. Yeah, like we don't have, it's got this really hard light, it's very directional, we don't have a lot of fog or mist or sky color, and that's kind of echoed in that red rock image, I think, in a really effective way. It would not feel the same if you had a lot of depth, if you had a lot of dust in the air, if you had very soft light. So just props to the photographer there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. So it's not only the environment, right? But it's our understanding of the environment that we bring into the image that allows us to interpret it in a certain way. And as you mentioned, Becca, environments are characters in and of themselves, right? And so we can go from environments that we understand and environments that we expect to ones like this that we don't expect and clearly pulls us out of the world we know and into something where we can suspend disbelief, right? Like there's enough here that we can recognize. We recognize buildings and mountains and streams, but here's architecture that is only reminiscent of architecture we may have seen before. It's not the same as things that we have here. So immediately, like the extravagance of everything begins to tell us something about this story that something like being in downtown Seattle is not going to give us. So maybe we can talk also a little bit about how environment can become a character. And I know that this is like a passionate subject for you, Becca, so I'd love to hear more on like what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to creating fantastical places, or just any kind of like speculative place, approaching it from that character design perspective, I think works incredibly well. So looking at something like this, we're considering, what kind of people live here, or organisms or whoever they are, and what are the defining characteristics that make them who they are. Are they warlike? Are they earth-loving? How, also considering the cultural implications that develop their lifestyle. Where did they get their food? How do they dress? What kind of things are important to their day-to-day lifestyle? Are they farming? Are they urban? Like, what kind of things go into them that make them as a culture? And then how do we reflect that in the architecture or the environment design or whatever it is that we have to create to represent this kind of community? And you can bring in then more kind of emotional elements to this sort of design too. Like, Are these people really dangerous? Do you want, when people meet them, does it feel sinister or deadly? This does not feel sinister or deadly, which of course then could be a fun narrative arc to flop on its head. But that isn't the first impression. It has that very kind of organic feel. It's integrated into the natural environment in a very authentic way. And that's, when we look at elves, that's what people tend to think, right? They're one with the world and the woods and the universe and nature and all that. And so that's then brought very organically into this design, the way that the architecture drops down there into the waterfall. It almost looks like it's grown on its own. It has this very delicate intricacy to the design if you go in closer, right? And there's kind of like these filigree sort of feelings on all like the gazebos and the top of the bridge there and the roof and these beautiful spires. And it's just a representation of the community and the culture of the people that live within it. But it also, of course, then isn't completely like out of our understanding of the real world. It's definitely representative of things that we recognize. We have this sort of Gothic influence in the architecture there too. And that's how you're going to, make sure that your audience who lives on planet Earth in the real world kind of understands what you're getting at. If you throw out something that doesn't look at all like a building or a castle or anything that they know, they aren't necessarily going to pick up what you're putting down. So being able to blend aspects of reality with then these fantastical character-driven elements is going to really elevate any kind of speculative environment.
Just throwing this up there on the screen really quickly. You can tell, obviously, that this is something that is important to the work that you do and that you create. And I know, for those of us who have not lived in the space of concept art, and we don't have to then go and consider, well, how do we build a concept from scratch? It's really fascinating to be able to hear how all of those elements can then play together. So if we were to stick a person in here, what do they look like? Because they're not going to be standing here in jeans and a t-shirt and a ball cap, right? And if they are, that's going to tell us an entirely different story than if we were to look at this environment and say, what do we expect somebody from this place to look like? And how do they fit naturally within this space? And, as you mentioned, one of the things that you said, is this a warlike people? Well, if you were to look at this environment, are there fortifications? Are there curtain walls? Are there portcullises and murder holes and other things that we could expect from the kind of people who need to protect themselves or go out and ravage other folks? There's none of that. And so that leads you to believe specific things about these people and what they might look like if you see them. And so being able to then place subjects within this environment, and I don't know if how well folks can see it, because I know it's small. Here's the fellowship right here, crossing the bridge. And this is obviously Rivendell from Lord of the Rings. If you're not a fantasy fan, I pity you. No, I don't really, but I kind of do. You're missing out on a lot of cool stuff.
An idea, even just like looking around like your room or your house or your office maybe, what kind of person do you see living in that space? Like if you can kind of remove yourself enough to step back and like look at your living room and make those judgments about your living room, what kind of person lives here? What is the environment saying about the kind of people who exist in this space? I think it's just kind of a good practice, for your own comfort and interest in interior design and living in an awesome house, but also just in a greater understanding of, what does space say about a person from, a very small scale.
Yeah, I want to leave that one open for thoughts because I know, so my environment clearly says that I like to make things and I am messy, and I 100% am. Like that's, my brain is a messy mess of a mess. And that is reflected in the places that I work, not always in the other places that I live. So if you were to walk through my house and look at that from a filmmaker's perspective, right? And if you were to say, let me try to show the audience what they should expect about this person by the place in which they live, my kitchen is almost always clean and my living room is usually picked up. My office is always a mess and my bed is rarely made. So you can draw your own conclusions about who I am or the inner workings of my mind and my personality by those things. But if you were then to take that and transmute that into a piece of art, that is the kind of, I think, subtlety that can become really powerful in interpretation. And before we move on to look at a few different images, I just want to point something out here. There's important things happening in the environment, not just here in the architecture. We have a storm clouds back here, right? But we have the sun peeking through and lighting up this place. Not only does that create contrast between the architecture and the place that these, creatures are living and the environment, but it actually tells something about the history of these people. This is the sunset of the time that they are spending on Earth for folks who know the history of these kinds of stories. And the past, their past, is fraught with war and sadness and danger and other things that they have been through. It has good things too, but this is obviously also a really great subtle depiction of the people group, of their history and who they are, what we can expect of them. So even those little pieces of environment can tell you a whole lot. And if you go back and you watch a movie and you pause in certain scenes, there are going to be a lot of subtle context clues in environment that let you know, number one, where you're at in the story. Are we in a place that's dangerous, or are we about to move into a place that's dangerous? Are we supposed to feel happy for them right now? And what environment are they in, and how is it lit? Because lighting is part of environment. Do we have warm, soft afternoon light? Do we have really strange, luminous storm light? Like, what is going on there? Even those pieces of environment are really powerful context clues that are going to help the audience interpret things about the subject matter without always even realizing it. Because if you remember, a big part of visual literacy are some of those evolutionary levers that we can pull, and how an environment is lit and what state an environment is in tells us a lot in milliseconds about that environment and the kind of people and the kind of, is it dangerous, et cetera, that we can expect. So you totally can. You just have to be willing to suck at it for a while. Like that's true, right? Like that's the question of anything where we're like, I want to be able to do that. Well, you can. You just have to be willing to be not good at it for as long as it takes to start being good at it. That's the story of all of us. The trick is, us artists tend to initially, when we live in that world, and we've talked about the ladder of mastery before, or the ladder of mastery, but when we tend to live in the, now I'm forgetting the name, when we tend to live in that unconscious incompetence phase, we still think that we're great. And we need that just long enough to recognize we're in that phase so we know we can move beyond it. Like, we need to be completely clueless to the fact that our work kind of sucks for a while so we can like chug through that phase. Otherwise, nobody would ever do things. Okay, so we've looked at a couple of those. We're gonna look at a few more. I grabbed that one. Let me shut these out since we've already taken a look at them. Is it this one that I want? Okay, so we talked earlier about environment, right? And how studio and the removal of the environment is also a really strong artistic choice. Like it's a clear creative choice that we're making. So if we take these two folks, it's both similar subject matter, and then we put them in different environments with then different styling. All of a sudden, we have a very different understanding of what we're supposed to be guessing about people. We have great context here, what we're looking at. We have no context here, and we have medium context here, right? Like we have kind of a close-up enough to get the fact that we're in a city. It's very clear that this is meant to be a studio setting, even though this could potentially be somewhere like outside where somebody just threw it up. We don't know that. All we have is the removal of environment. And then here we have lots of environment. We have lots of context clues. The subject matter is really small within the environment. So when we're looking at creative choices like this, all of a sudden the interpretation of the subject matter changes. Like, here's a person, we might have caught them just walking down the street, right? Like they could be just going about their life and we caught a candid portrait. Here's a very purposeful photo of a person. Everything is showing you that this is on purpose. And here's another candid, but the question becomes, given the additional context of the environment, is it even so important who this person is per se? Or is the context really the subject matter here? So comparing just these 3 images, I wonder what stands out to folks the most about environment here, and what maybe conclusions we can draw from the artist's intent. Like, can we draw any conclusions about the artist's intent and the subject matter just from what they've chosen to include in the frame? If you're in the audience today, would love to hear from you. So please put that in the comments. Would love to hear. And Sharon, just let me find my mouse again. Just saying, yep, that's the piece. I am missing being willing to suck at it for a little while. And for so much of us, that's true. Like, if we're not good at something immediately, we just go, oh, I'm not good at this thing. But that's not true. We need to be okay with sucking at it for a while. So what do you think, y'all? If we were looking and maybe just comparing these 3 images purely based on the context of the environment, is there a difference, you think, in what the artists are trying to say, and what could that be?
When it comes to studio work specifically, like going back to the woman on the pink drop, the color communicates, right? But I think it's also the intention, right? So because in a studio setting, on a sweep or a, whatever, actually on a sweep versus a hand painted backdrop or fabrics or whatever, you are dialing in on having the subject be the only thing that communicates. So whether that's through lighting and styling, makeup, that kind of thing, it's still all about the subject and what they are communicating through expression or not, versus when you're in a location or an environment, all of the sudden, like Becca was talking about earlier, that also becomes a character because it then communicates itself, even if you take the subject away. If you take the subject out of the studio piece, right, there is nothing to communicate other than pink, right? So I think it's important to understand what it is you're wanting to say before you go and say, like, okay, let's do a thing here. Okay, why? Right? So if you have a subject that wants to be in a city, or you're a documentary photographer and you want that, like all of the rubble that person is running through, are they carrying something? Is it a doctor's bag? Like, then you start to understand, like, okay, what is that? Is it milk?
Looks like milk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you're trying to feed people, right? Or yourself or your family, and you're in this war zone and you can see the people fighting behind, right? All of that then is communicated in the image itself, right? Whereas when you're in the studio setting, it's really more about what that person is trying to say versus what the photographer is saying instead.
So a take on the studio portraits. I don't know if this is just my own weird kind of read on them, but I feel like when you have a very kind of classic and sort of plain environmentless portrait, or, editorial, whatever, anything like this that's shot in a studio, I feel like it elevates the subject kind of to the sense of importance. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm a model. I go to photo studios and people want to take my picture. And even if it's just, it's a portrait client who hires you, they want that kind of glamorous experience. And that's what that seamless backdrop communicates, is that I am important enough to be
photographed. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like there is that sense of elevation created explicitly by that environment, as simple as that environment may be.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we recognize, like, we intuitively know what a studio looks like because we have seen portraits taken in studios. That's where you go to take pictures of somebody. So if you're there, like you said, you're there for the sole purpose of having your photo taken. And that, of course, says something entirely different than an image like this, where it's like, well, this person could have just been captured taking their jacket off on the street. street photographer took this. We don't know. Was this person involved in the taking of their own photo? We don't know. There aren't any context clues that can give us insight into that. They're not looking at the camera. They're just taking off their jackets. They're on a city street. What can we infer? I mean, that is obviously an entirely different story than I'm here to have my photo taken, or here is a person going about their normal business is an entirely abnormal situation. And then the question becomes, what's the subject here? Well, obviously this person is the subject, but are they? Or is the subject matter really, how does life go on when everything has fallen apart? And here's a person delivering milk in an area that has been obviously torn apart by war. What is more unexpected or normal than getting your groceries, right? So really, really interesting to think about the difference between what you choose to include and what you remove, and how that speaks to what we understand about everything.
So this one I think is interesting. Like, it feels like candid, you know. It almost feels like kind of like, you know, people they're hanging out. It doesn't give me like totally stranger vibes, but I feel like we wiped that background and replaced it with seamless. Suddenly, it could very easily be like campaign for streetwear.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the power of environment is real there, right? Like, makes a real difference. So as we're starting to kind of move toward the end, I'm going to go ahead and drop these away really quickly because we have looked at them. And I want to grab this one by Kat and just touch on. So here, Kat, you have got the chance to put together several really unexpected things, right? Like that the average person doesn't get to see or experience this thing in their normal life, which also we get the sense of kind of whimsy and magic from that, right? Because how often is a beautiful girl in a beautiful dress riding a shaggy pony in the wintertime in this gorgeous wintertime location? So maybe you can give us kind of some insight into your putting this image together, and specifically what it was about, you know, this environment that made it important for us to be able to understand something about what you wanted to say about the subject.
So it was really one of these moments, the woman writing, her name is Belle. And I typically work with her once a year. She's just one of those people that showed up in like 2015 and I photographed. We had really great chemistry and we just stayed in touch and we just get together and play. And her mom and I, because her mom is, I think, my age. Yeah, I think she's my age. And so Belle is 6'2", and the shoulder of this horse is 6'2". But it was one of those like, okay, when it snows, we're gonna shoot. Like, and so I just had like, I brought dresses home and was just like, all right, but if it snows, you're gonna have to come get me because my car is tiny. And they happen to live, you know, in the same outskirts of town that I do. So they got in their, you know, giant truck from their farm and came and got me. And like, Belle's a trooper, right? Like, she's without sleeves in a tulle dress, and it was like raining snow, like that big, heavy, wet snow. But it was just about like, they have a farm and, you know, she trains horses and teaches people to ride and all of this stuff. And she just wanted something really kind of magical because everybody else is all like tough, plaid wearing jeans, boots, and muck, right? And that is the opposite of what she does. You know, like, well, not the opposite. She does all of those things, right? But she wanted to bring her own sense of just femininity and wonder into what she loves about working with horses. And it snowed, it came down, we got like 10 inches in less than an hour. And it was just like, oh, all right, Courtney, come get me. And that's how we ended up with this.
Love that. It's so cool to hear, as I think this is might be Sharon, but as friends in the Facebook land are saying, it's really, really cool to hear the backstory behind images like this when you get to create them, because then you get that additional context. And I think, you know, from what you explained, I mean, that's exactly what we get here. There's the whimsy and the femininity and the kind of magic of images like this. And it's so unexpected that, of course, you kind of want to stop and go, whoa, what's happening here? And that, which of course is completely different than some of the images we have seen where the subject matter is exactly who we expect them to be and exactly in the environment in which we expect them. And so in a way, it kind of blends together instead of having that great contrast of like, what's a beautiful girl in a fancy dress doing out in the snow on a horse, right? So we have contrast of subject and environment, which then of course creates an entirely different and interesting type of context.
Hypothermia is real.
Yeah. I was just thinking to myself, like, her fingers are probably so red right now.
Oh my God. She's, like I said, she's such a trooper. Like, she would just get off and be like, and be like, okay, wrap her up.
No kidding, poor thing. Okay, so we are kind of getting close to the end of our hour here. And just to kind of grab a couple more things that Kat had shared really quickly so we can see those kind of differences in environment. And here we have like some badass chicks and it's urban wear, right? And then you have a kind of like an urban art environment or like an art environment behind them, which seems to fit, right? Like we don't have the same type of mental disconnect between what is a girl in a ball gown doing out in the snow on a horse. So like urban wear in an urban environment seems to kind of have a solidity, right? That like you kind of expect to see something like that. And then moving on to here, we have just enough of a contrast that makes you a little bit curious, right? Like she's got a gorgeous little black dress on and she's clearly posed here. So clearly this environment was chosen really specifically. It's not like one of the photos we saw earlier where did we capture somebody on accident? The pose and the lighting and the clothing choice obviously tells us what's happening here was on purpose, as opposed to, and like the same here, right? These are all very purposeful, as opposed to some of the images that we saw earlier that could have been taken by a street photographer or, you know, just caught on the fly. So when we look at these, Kat, and we're looking at here an environment that really seems to fit kind of the purpose of the shot. And then here where we go, okay, so this was chosen for a reason. What do you think were like you wanted to communicate at the time with these two that are kind of similar but have an important difference?
So it's the specificity, right? So shooting in Dumbo, right? This client wanted to showcase like her home base being in New York City, but she also wanted to show up like being styled in a way that was obviously elevated. She's wearing, you know, $1,500 shoes and her jewelry is not costume. And like she owns Brooklyn, right? Is really how she was wanting to show up. Whereas if you go to the other image, the really cool thing about this, if you zoom in, you'll actually see that the woman second from left, right, is the adult, and the other three are all teenagers. And it's in an urban environment here in Asheville. It's very well known, and actually all of that art has been covered up and transformed into something else now. But the woman actually leads a group called My Sister Taught Me That, and these are, you know, young women that she has raised from, you know, little tiny babies to be like strong, powerful women. And she really wanted to convey that in a way that was like supportive and still like cool as hell, right? But that allowed them to sort of see their power. So you even see like the camera angle being, you know, slightly lower, just to really speak to that power and that presence.
Yeah, and I think, you know, obviously a very clear choice to include the lion's head in this, right? So you could have cropped in tight. You could have changed, you know, the camera angle. If we read the image like this without some of that additional context, we would still have that kind of cool, like urban vibe, but we would be missing some of the additional stuff. Like this is a really powerful little piece to add into the thing. And then of course, like you said, you know, the fact that we're kind of low and they are elevated also really speaks. So we have like all of the aspects of visual literacy tying together looking up, same thing here, right? We're looking up at her. So she's kind of in a position of power. She's not even deigning to look down at us as the audience, right? She's laughing or smiling at somebody. She's gorgeous and in charge. She's in control of the situation here. So like all of these context clues that we have when the environment is included that give us different interpretations of how we're supposed to understand things. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen as we near the end of the hour. Just want to see if we have final thoughts and then invite our friends who are hanging out, you know, on Facebook or on YouTube. After we've had the chance to look at many of these images and see not only vastly different images, but vastly different environments and how either the environment contributes to, causes contrast, or the removal of the environment contributes to how we're supposed to interpret it. What are your thoughts? And is there anything you feel like you have questions about or you'd like to leave people with to think about environment as it relates to visual literacy?
So I kind of had a question. Cat, stop. Not human cat, animal cat. So we approached this morning a little bit different, but I was curious for you guys, or, you know, anyone in the audience today, how your own actual environment, we kind of touched on this with the, you know, house example. Has that really impacted the way that you create and depict art? Which maybe since we're at the end of the hour, that is a little bit too deep, but I'm curious for you guys, because I know like Matt, you live in, you know, the great wild wonderland that is Maine. Like, you know, Kat, you were just talking about like these outskirts of town, and including that into that area, you know, with that client Belle. And of course, Nicole, you've lived all over the place and you've seen all these incredible different landscapes. And I'm curious if that has impacted the way that you guys see environment and what kind of stuff it draws you to.
I think there's a couple of aspects there. One, I think for where I live, the environment brings a certain type of person that wants a certain type of look in their images. So, you know, it just becomes part of my process. Where, yeah, I'm in Maine, there's trees and rivers and rocks and stuff, and a lot of people want that as the environment. So I don't necessarily get the choice of it. What I get is the choice of the minutia of where we go in composition and how I angle things and lighting and all that. But they, you know, they bring that on almost as an outfit, right? They want to be wrapped in this type of environment. I think shooting in the studio for me, regardless of what's outside, shooting in the studio has created bad habits in me where I just take a lot of it for granted. Like, this is what I do in a studio, and I don't really think beyond it the way that I do. And instead of challenging myself to say, even though I'm in a studio, how can I use this environment differently? I get lazy and I create some bad habits. So I like thinking about this differently as I go back into the studio. I've got a shoot coming up. How am I going to use that differently to tell that person's story? So I love exercise like this, and very similar to what we were doing last night. It gives me new perspectives, especially when you were talking about Rivendell, how the environment can be its own character and how I can incorporate that into the person's story and vice versa. So this type of stuff just gives me a lot to think about in my own work, and break out of some of those plateaus and bad habits that we all get into, doing the same stuff over and over.
That's super cool. I love that you mentioned the environment like an outfit. And I think that that's a really great way to think about it when you're doing portraiture. Like, this is just another thing we're putting on to help show you who this person is and what they think about themselves and what you're supposed to think about them. And to answer your question, Becca, I think I have two things. First is my space that I create art in. So not like the greater environment, but my office is very purposefully set up for the creation of art. It's set aside from everything else. And if we were to, you know, read that, it's not in my bedroom. It's not in a place where like it's dual purpose, right? So the making of the art has to be an extension of everything else. It's its own thing. I get a step aside into this space that is purposefully made for the creation of art. So even mentally, I think that switches things up, like going from your bedroom to the kitchen to wherever. as opposed to stepping into your office, right? Like that's a whole change. The environment changes the way you think about what you're about to do. This is a special thing, right? Even though, unfortunately, I don't have a door where I can close out the world, as you guys have often seen when my naked children run into the bathroom. You know, it's this area set aside for that. Other people don't get to use it. So that, I think, walking into an environment has a really strong mental effect on how you approach what you do there, which is why a lot of therapists will say the bedroom should be for sleeping. Like the bedroom is for sleeping and intimacy, and that should be it, because your brain needs to be able to make those mental connections to make those things more likely and easier for people who struggle with that kind of stuff. But then as far as the context of what art I create, I think a lot of my work tends to be environmental. And I think that is because I have a really deep kind of emotional connection to the environment. And ever since I was little, if I could be outside with no shoes on, that's what I did. And I lost so many shoes that way. I would run out into the woods and fling my shoes off. And my mom started buying me those jelly shoes just so she could actually afford to keep shoes on my feet. And the same thing is true now. I never feel more connected than when I am out in a place. More connected to other people, more connected to the environment. And so when I want to tell stories, which almost all of my images, if they're not telling stories, I don't want them. So I'm always either choosing or creating an environment that contributes to the story that I want to tell. So I don't know if that's just a result of loving it or also being like a movie fanatic or what, but for sure, living in different places, being able to be in different environments and experience those and feeling more connected to life in general, absolutely, I think influences like my desire to include environment in the images that I make. Yeah.
I think maybe I misheard the question. Can you repeat it? Because I'm like, wait,
Just has your own actual physical environment impacted the way you create art? Like for instance,
for sure.
Yeah,
1000%. And it like even down to like just the cleanliness or order or lack of order, right, affects how I create, whether that's in studio or with a location. If it's absolute chaos and I can't find anything, I get frustrated, and then like I'm super fast to make decisions that maybe aren't the best for the project at hand. Let alone the places that I've lived, like looking at it from a larger space of like, okay, well, if we're talking about Boston versus Asheville, two very different places, let alone versus Sarasota, right? But I also understand how each of those spaces or types of spaces, like city, small town, beach town, all speak to me personally. And why is this person choosing this location, right? Like, why do they want to go to the beach versus downtown? Why do they want to be on a horse in the middle of a snowstorm versus the top of the Empire State Building, or the top of a building with the Empire State Building in the background? Like, what is it that they're communicating based on how that place speaks to them? And the only way I can draw from that is knowing how that place speaks to me. Does that make sense?
Love it. So I know Bassam is with us and he's been quiet. Oh, there he is.
Hello.
Hi, Bassam.
Hey, sorry guys, I really wasn't in a position to actually show my face or talk, but just kind of a summary after having listened to you. Sorry I couldn't participate. Just a kind of a summary, what one word that comes to mind, and an important concept in what we do, is the word cohesiveness. If you look at the environment versus the subject versus what we're trying to convey, and you know, unless you're looking to destabilize your audience or your viewers, cohesiveness is what it's all about, right? So the example of the 3 photos that you showed with the model in the pink, you know, and in the studio, and the gentleman outside, and then the war zone, I can, you know, there is cohesiveness there. And if you move the model from the studio, put her where that man was on the street, it would still be cohesive, semi-cohesive, right? But if you move her and put her in that war zone, it would be completely out of balance. and it would confuse the audience. So kind of that's the concept that I retain from this. And you know, another example, if you look at Kat's a client, you know, if somebody's wearing $1,500 shoes and you want to show them in a couch, you're not going to put them in $100 couch, right? So it's these types of things that you want to kind of be in tune with when you're working with your client and try to figure out what they want to, you know, draw out of the photo shoot and how they want to represent themselves. So yeah, I just thought I would add that as kind of the one word that I would take away from an environment versus subject versus overall look perspective.
Ooh, I think that's so interesting, Bassam, and definitely when something is not cohesive, that tells a story in a, you know, like in a whole different way, right? Like you said, if we were to take somebody in $1,500 shoes, which you see sometimes has been done in editorial work, they will take somebody in a $40,000 outfit and put them in a junk old building, you know, and the whole idea there is, right, the contrast of dilapidation versus the richness of all of these things. And unless it's very clear to the viewer that that's done purposefully, then you're right, it starts to feel confusing. And you wonder why this is happening, which leads to questions of its own. So I think making sure that intent is there and we understand what it is we're trying to say when we make those environmental choices is really, really a big deal. All right, y'all. So we are a little past the end of the hour, but I think we had a really fantastic conversation today. We got to cover a lot of ground. So instead of asking for final thoughts today, I'm just going to go ahead and, you know, I think we kind of covered that a little bit. So I'm just going to bring things to a close. But first, thanks to everybody who was hanging out with us today in audience land. Y'all are amazing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts in the comments today. And of course, come back and do that again on Monday, where we will be together again at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. That's 6 a.m. for the West Coast and 9 a.m. for the East Coast afternoon for our friends overseas, talking about visual literacy. We're going to continue this visual literacy conversation all the way up until we're finished with it, and hopefully bringing examples that you guys can check out to, you know, help elucidate things a little bit more. But that is not until Monday. So the weekend is coming up. We hope you guys have a fantastic one. Go make something amazing. And until Monday morning, have a great one, everybody. Bye.